So here we are, a kind of small miracle. I have a small introduction for Toby. Obviously, it's a great pleasure to welcome Toby as a keynote speaker. Toby is a historian. I hope I will not say anything dumb. He's a historian of Africa, an economic historian whose work has focused extensively on long-term dynamics of inequality, particularly in pre-colonial Africa and in the global south. His research has consistently emphasized the importance of placing African history at the center of global analysis, especially when thinking about questions of development and inequality. These perspectives are particularly relevant when reflecting on the global consequence of the COVID response, which affected different regions of the world in profoundly unequal ways. When I invited him to give this lecture, Toby asked me quite innocently, why me? As if his role in these debates had been entirely unremarkable. But I know for a fact that many people in this room would answer that question differently. His interventions came at an early stage in the pandemic, at a time when the terms of the academic debate were experienced by most of us as constrained. Certain forms of critique were read through political labels, which made sustained engagement with their substance more difficult. To engage publicly under these conditions required a degree of intellectual independence and indeed courage. For a number of scholars, Toby's work provided not only a set of arguments, but also a reference point that made it easier to articulate positions that might otherwise have remained unexpressed. This was also visible at the public launch of the second edition of his book, The COVID Consensus, in London in 2023, with co-author Thomas Fazzi, which brought together a selected audience, including several participants in this room, and who first met on that occasion. Until today, that event is unfailingly described by those present as a particularly significant moment in the COVID years, one in which a more open and collective form of academic engagement around these questions seemed to emerge at long last. It also drew the presence of figures like Sumitra Gupta and Jayda Lecharya, reflecting the broader importance attributed to that moment within those debates. More broadly, it is worth noting that this conference itself is in many ways a product of that period. Before the pandemic, only a small number of us knew each other. So our connections mostly emerged through the exchanges of the past few years, mainly on social media. Despite all the criticism, we can address them, and Toby is not last to do exactly that, to criticize social media. They made it possible for scholars who might otherwise never have encountered each other to connect and engage in discussions over COVID. In that sense, COVID, despite its difficulties, also gave rise to new intellectual networks and collaborations, of which this conference is one example. So, to cut a long story short, it is therefore a form of poetic justice and a great pleasure to have Toby with us today. So please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much, Muriel. Is this slideshow?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, and welcome to dear friends, les amis, les chercheurs, nos amis, nos collègues qui sont en ligne, Juliette et Laurent. C'est triste pour nous que vous n'êtes pas ici avec nous, mais on est très content que vous êtes là quand même virtuellement. Thank you very much to Muriel for arranging this event, which, as we all know, there have not been many events like this. And so it's important. It's it's important. So thank you very much, Muriel, for having managed to bring this together and create a space where we can all speak and share thoughts and express things. And my intention in my talk is really, I am going to try and express things that still are not expressed very much. And that is the intention. And in fact, there is going to be quite a big digital side, so I'm sure we will enjoy discussing that afterwards. And the lecture, it will try and be an act of memory. I want to reflect on how humans have changed since 2020. And what I want to do to start with, therefore, is to recall what things were like before COVID, which is actually quite difficult because, and I was thinking that as you spoke, Muriel, because one of the things that has really been so severely eroded, I think, in the last 6 years is our sense of time. So when you talked about the launch in January 2023, I thought, well, it feels like 3 years ago, but it might have been 6 years ago, it might have been 8 years ago. Time is one of the things which we're struggling with, I think. But one thing is at least seared into my memory, that is that in January 2020, I got a new laptop from King's, and I opened it up and I started using it, and it was very slow to start. And then I discovered that the reason it was very slow to start was because there was this fucking thing called Teams, which was slowing it down. What was this thing? I didn't want Teams. What was this thing? And then 3 months later, all of our university interactions were on Teams. Funny how things work out. And now it's second nature for most of us to suggest a Teams call, to be more remote and semi-detached from our places of work, which of course we did do that pre-COVID, particularly on Skype, remember that? But generally for people who are a long way away, and it certainly wasn't something that we would ever have considered doing with people who were our colleagues, and so we had more presence, which in a sense we've lost, which is why it's good to be here. And then there was the nature of teaching, writing, cheating at it, and of course lazy human beings have always cut corners, we all know that, and generally that desire adapts to the tools we have. Pre-COVID, of course, we all had plagiarism checkers to make sure that students hadn't copied out text their essays from the work of others, and that often used to happen. Some people got around that by buying essays when they had a looming deadline, which they didn't feel like meeting. So there was a cottage industry, some of you will know, of poorer grad students writing essays for lazy, richer students. And a friend of mine once sat next to somebody in the British Library who was doing exactly that. So that's another line of work which artificial intelligence has thrown to the wall. And certainly, if I was ruthless, destructive, and elitist enough to have a product like AI to sell, manipulating a medical problem into a way to force everyone to stay at home for 2 years, staring at their screens as if they will magically provide a solution, just before launching my product onto the market, would be something which I would consider. We can begin to make a summary of a few befores and afters, which I'm going to do as I go through the talk. So before COVID-19, you may remember, it was the era of climate strikes, led by Greta. After COVID-19, people thought it was fine to use AI to generate literally bullshit texts for them, rather than to do the hard work of reading and thinking, in spite of the gargantuan energy demands of AI. Before COVID-19, there was a serious discussion about the negative effects of screen time on the young and attempts to mitigate it. April 2019. During COVID-19, it was thought fine to throw the young in front of screens almost permanently, so that now some young children entering nursery don't know how to turn the pages of a book. Instead, they push the text to the side of the page, expecting it to flip, as on a screen. And the longer we spent on screens during COVID, the greater the variety, depth and tortuous nature of the rabbit holes that we could go down. So that we became more and more fragmented, although, as you said, Muriel, we also made connections, but we were more and more cast into opposing and yet weirdly interlocking silos, where differences were magnified but also somehow collapsed, so that radical leftist anti-Covidians and anti-Zionists might now find themselves easily on the same side as MAGA influencers such as Nick Fuentes, Tucker Carlson and David Duke, former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. Before COVID-19, far left and far right had very different profiles. Since COVID-19, they have become increasingly indistinguishable, so that many of us feel we're living through the 1930s redux. Maybe that's enough to pause for a moment to consider the panorama which I hope to open up. Hopefully what I've said already, and I think everybody in this room and online, everybody agrees with this, it was woefully inadequate to consider COVID-19 as a medical crisis. It's clearly something far more reaching than that, in its relationships to human subjectivities, interactions, and how indeed that also reflects our place in the natural world. Are we in fact, to use Jean Baudrillard's ideas, becoming a simulacrum of humanity in the post-COVID era? I don't have an answer to that question, but I think it's a question we have to ask. And without articulating the problems we face, we can't confront them. My view is, as I summarised in my abstract, that this was an event of world historical significance which exposed transformations in our subjectivities which since have radically expanded, and it reveals itself to me, at least, as a crisis which suggests that human species no longer has confidence in its future as humans. My intention in this lecture is to sketch out the main symptoms of this unease and reflect on what it might mean for us all collectively. So I will do that to begin with by beginning from the premise that COVID-19 pandemic makes far more sense as a historical event if we consider it as a technical, economic and human transformation than it ever did as a medical emergency. It reflects changing relationships with age and the idea of death. And I was reminded of this recently when a dear friend of mine passed away at the age of 90. And some of our mutual acquaintance wrote to me and said, I had no idea he was unwell. Even at 90, it seems, people should be expected to continue on and on as if somehow we've all become immortal. No longer is pneumonia considered the old man's friend, as my wife's grandmother, born 1919, used to call it. Instead, we can destroy society in order to try and protect the elderly, and at the same time invert our value systems and claim that in doing this we are valuing the elderly, even as we isolate them from all their human connections. Considering how the recent years have led to an inversion of value, symbolic fears and alienation from ourselves and from others may give us a far more real sense of the COVID experience than empirical evidence on its own. In fact, I think it does. Towards the end of those terrible years, my friend Frank Armstrong, who edits Cassandra Voices, wrote to me with a powerful thought. He's noticed that the Victorians were obsessed with death, wrote about it all the time, but never mentioned sex. And we in the 21st century are obsessed with sex, write about it all the time, and never mention death. Maybe that might explain, Frank suggests, how we turned the avoidance of death into an shibboleth which ultimately all but destroyed our societies. Symbolic power is very real, and we shouldn't dismiss lightly these sort of insights that these perspectives can give on what we've experienced since 2020. So in the next part of the lecture, I'm going to try and confront in fairly summary form some of these transformations which indicate what I think is the truly historic nature of our experience. I'll do this through two frames. First, the digital, and then related economic and political transformations, all of which for me is suggestive of the human transformation we've undergone. So we begin with the digital. Pre-2020, this is the before and after. Pre-2020, nobody used AirPods to block out the world around them. Now they're so common we barely notice them. What we've experienced in the past 6 years is a radical transformation in our subjectivities, and as with previous transformations in history like that, it's linked to a new form of mediation, and also to wars, with the leading moralisers of the day seeking to weaponise these, largely in an attempt to cement their own social power rather than any desire to resolve them, as of course was also the case in the 16th century wars of religion. With the invention of painting, in the case of the Dordogne, the Cantabrian Mountains, the caves of the Sahara, then of writing, then of printing, then of the internet, at each stage a new layer of distance is placed between us and the world. A distance which we painfully try to bridge with meaningful symbolic representations of that world, which we can't grasp precisely because of the distance which is mediated. Indeed, as a historian of Africa, I share the perspective of the late Christopher Ehret, who died last year. Great historical linguist of East Africa in particular. And in this, which was his last book, he articulated the relationship between the emergence of language around 75,000 years ago and the emergence of symbolic representations in southern Africa within the few thousand years before that. Language represents the world, but also creates a distance from it, which we then try to bridge with symbolic representations in art, music and writing. And that is essential to human beings as we've always understood ourselves, doing that. So we might add, as soon as we begin the process of subcontracting that symbolic representation to computation, or AI, we are losing the essential feature which defines and has always defined what it is to be human. As Baudrillard understood, the more we surround ourselves with symbolic ideations, the greater the strength of our subjectivity in relation to these simulacra. This is how mediation creates narcissism, which almost everyone agrees is such an enormous problem in our time, even though few of us will confront why it is being caused. And moreover, the more we are surrounded by these mediated simulacra, the more we can only resolve the distance through acts of destruction, trying to bridge the gulf between ourselves and the mediated symbolic world. So it is that as we become ever more subjectified, the world becomes rendered ever more as a series of objects, data points, or, as the German writer W.G. Sebald once put it, problems to be controlled. The explosion of these frames of mediation in 2020 is therefore not a small aspect of the changes that we've undergone. As we've all spent more time online in order to save lives, the process of subjectification through simulacra exploded. With it inevitably grew narcissism, and this can explain, in my view, no small part of what we've witnessed ever since. Another way of looking at it is that what happened in 2020 was essentially that digital forms of social connection finally overtook these old-fashioned in-person ones that human beings had managed with fairly well for about 100,000 years. Moreover, very swiftly on the heels of this came the rollout of artificial intelligence, to which some of the core attributes of humanity were rapidly farmed out. Of course, remote communication and networking weren't new in 2020, but what has happened since is their assumption of a normative and even default position, alongside the diminishing of our own creation of symbolic representations of the world with the rise of AI, something which has profound human and, of course, economic consequences I'll talk about in a minute. In economic terms, I put the digital revolution like this in the first edition of the COVID consensus, as we mentioned, Muriel published in April 2021. Many left-wing liberals dismissed anti-lockdown views as a domain of the libertarian press, espousing corporate interests. They had become so immersed in the algorithms driving internet giants that they failed to grasp that these corporate interests were just as invested in the lockdown policy. These critics no longer recognise this as a corporate agenda, as it had become so intimately intertwined with their lives and identities. Facebook's revenue, for instance, grew by 22% in the third quarter of 2020 alone, as people relied more than ever on social media to stay connected. What was at stake was therefore something much more profound than a straightforward conflict between left and right. It was a struggle, goes on, at the heart of capitalism between the traditional press and the business interests it has always represented, hotels, restaurants, high street shops, and the new corporate giants who didn't require such promotion as they created a much vaster propaganda of their own online. As we all know, this transformation has continued apace ever since, so we can make a summary of some of the key aspects of the digital takeover. First, the catastrophic collapse of reading. We all know that our attention spans have collapsed. When one of my more curmudgeonly older colleagues said to me that he didn't think he could any more longer sit down and read, say, a novel by Balzac, he's a historian of France, it became clear to me how generalised the inability to concentrate had become. We know it ourselves when we're writing something, we're feeling distracted at the same time as something we want to check on the internet. How can we be present? How can our words be present and meaningful if we're not really engaged when we produce them? How can we read something with attention if we're simultaneously aware of and distracted by 20 chats we've got on going at the same time? Alongside the collapse in reading is the collapse in writing. What collapse in writing, some will say? AI can write more effectively and certainly in greater volume than ever before. And of course that's the point. I know through conversations I've had with my students that even the brightest and sharpest of them are using AI to cut down, for example, their essays to the word limit at the very least, to come up with research pointers, to begin directing them towards approaches, and in a maximal sense, they may simply use it to spew out screens of text, which is literally bullshit, in the sense coined by Harry Frankfurt in this classic book. That is text, which has no care for the truth value of what is proposed. And as I said already, if I had a product like AI to sell, and with it the assault on autonomous thinking which has gone with that, I don't think you could do much better than what we saw during the COVID years. Of course, as with most human trends in history, we've entered a reaction phase. Now in London on the tube, for instance, you'll see people reading books sometimes, except that some of my colleagues now dismiss this as performative reading. And that, of course, symbolises the changes in subjectivity I'm trying to pinpoint here, that performativity and the simulacrum of an activity has come to step in for that activity itself in so many spheres, even with something as simple as reading a physical object, or as we used to call them, books. Some will say, does it all matter? The new forms of digital reading and writing simply reflect a different form of engagement with the world, and structurally that is true. And I'm not necessarily giving a value judgment. What I'm doing is describing and summarising our transformation collectively, which we've experienced, something which still I feel is quite rarely articulated. We all know something in us has changed, and many of us might experience that as a greater alienation from ourselves. But how often do we actually come out and state it plainly and try to articulate what it might mean? Moreover, if we are really concerned and alarmed by the geopolitical crises we are also experiencing, it would be foolish to dismiss what I've said. For we also know that new forms of mediation between human subjects in the world have generally triggered periods of catastrophic mass violence. This may not be relevant to our current conjuncture. The internet is, as I've said, the latest in a long line of factors of separation. So, as a historian, I've been thinking about these questions. The development of writing in Mesopotamia and North Africa around 5,000 years ago saw the concentration of power, development of mass enslavement to build the monuments of Assyria, Damascus and Egypt, which are now declared to be foundational of civilization. Commercialization of the printing press in the second half of the 15th century in Europe after the launch of the Gutenberg Bible, 1455, enabled the Reformation and sparked centuries of religious wars. It also facilitated the conquest of the Americas by the Spanish, and thereby the genocide of the Native Americans and the transatlantic slave trade from West Africa, because the Vikings had, after all, sailed to Newfoundland about 5 centuries before, but the lack of widely circulating tracts of their deeds bigging up the potential of the New World meant that nothing much changed until the Spanish performed the same trick in 1492, shortly after the printing press had been inaugurated. So it would be surprising if our era would turn out differently. Do people really think we're any different? Or, to put it bluntly, something I seem to have got quite good at in recent years, better than our ancestors? Apparently, many today think so, judging by the ritual declarations of horror in some quarters of the current turn of world political events. Certainly far easier to point the finger at some other group and feel good about ourselves, at Jews, at Muslims, at MAGA Christians like Pete Hegseth, than to consider the broader crisis of which we're all part, and which we're all experiencing, or to accept, as I also put it in the first edition of the COVID consensus, that while technologies may change, humans don't. In sum, if we consider the transformation of relationship between human subjects and the world since 2020, we can see the lockdown era as a defining one, both in the sedimentation of the default normativity of digital mediation, the wars that have followed since, and in grooming us for this transformation in the processes of reading and writing that have characterized human beings ever since we became a species, recognizably human. So that now these tasks are increasingly executed by machines. So, this transformation in subjectivity connects to the second frame which I'm going to discuss, which is the political economy, which is, as you said, Muriel, probably closer to my wheelhouse, really. For another core aspect of finding what it is to be human is the engagement in productive forms of work, which is also now under assault. Pre-2020, the idea of the universal basic income was a utopian policy developed initially by the Green movement as a means of addressing inequality. Post-COVID, it's become a kind of desperate idea to address the looming crisis of work. I haven't got space to address this here properly. I'm going to do so in a lecture in London in June. What we can certainly say is that, as noted before, work became increasingly digital during COVID and since. Home working grew. I know a number of young people who got jobs since 2020 who can't leave their apartments because they haven't got an office and they've got to work digitally. These are not people with nice gardens or spacious semis. Inequities of the lockdown era, of course, solidified into the new working environment characterised almost above else by generational inequality. And it's hard for me, as an economic historian, to separate our transformation in subjectivities, which I've just discussed, from these economic questions. In fact, they're deeply connected. Because we knew, long before COVID, that the internet favoured monopolies. Amazon, Google, Facebook, Twitter had shown this very clearly. So there could only be one economic outcome of placing all business online in 2020, and that was the rampant consolidation and expansion of these monopolies, alongside a generalised assault on small and medium enterprises. I've got a Californian student writing a dissertation on this very issue and outcome in California, which hasn't been reversed and which still nobody wants to talk about on the front. So we knew before 2020 that this was the inevitable outcome of moving online. And it was also inevitable that the enormity of the quantitative easing that took place in 2020 would lead to a massive increase in inequality. In the world which we inhabit, if large amounts of money are effectively printed by governments, it is inevitable that the wealthiest people in this world will grab hold of most of it. It's impossible to imagine any other outcome. And that's, of course, exactly what had already happened during the financial crisis in 2008-9. And it's where I part company from Thomas here about in economics, because I don't think that modern monetary theory, which he is an advocate of, actually offers a solution. I think it actually simply seeks to explain away, on utopian and unrealisable terms, the problem, which really began in 1971 when Nixon decoupled the dollar from gold, beginning the process of currency's dematerialism, which mirrors many of the trends I've also been talking about how the material world is increasingly consumed through mediatised simulacra. How much money was printed? In their recent book, In COVID's Wake, Princeton political scientists Stephen Marcello and Frances Lee do extremely valuable comparative analysis of COVID spending alongside other economic crises of the last century. And what they show is that in real terms, US spending on COVID was 5 times that of the financial crisis, because this is 2020 and 2021, and 7 times that of the New Deal. So often when I say this to people who have not shared our experience of the last 6 years, to underline, I have to say it again because I generally get met with blank stares. COVID spending was 500% more than that of the financial crisis. 700% more than that of the New Deal in the US. In other words, the amount of money that was printed dwarfs anything else seen in financial history since the decoupling of the dollar from gold in 1971 by an enormous amount. And as I said, the inevitable outcome of that was the increase in inequality, the upward transfer of wealth that we see, as Thomas and I wrote about in the second edition of the book. Something now compounded, of course, by the inflation which then followed such an inevitable literal printing of money without the increase of goods coming to market. So, to reiterate, the economic outcomes of these policies were structurally inevitable to anyone with a working knowledge of economics. Monopolies were bound to become bigger with the move to the digital. Inequality was bound to increase massively with this vast money printing exercise. What has this meant worldwide? In Africa, as discussed in our recent article, economists talk of structural adjustment 2.0, the new era of austerity. A Nigerian colleague, I've been talking to a PhD student of mine in Nigeria at the moment who's having a terrible experience which is effectively created by this. And people in Nigeria say this is far worse even than structural adjustment in the 1980s, even though it's unreported. Across the world, as the book edited and published by the United Nations University in 2024 summarised, the world's 2 billion informal workers have faced a shock and assault on their working lives and incomes, which has not been addressed. In a new article in this book, which I'm co-editing, which is coming out to see soon, a team from OP Jindal University in New Delhi look at the impacts on informal workers in one neighbourhood, Kapashira. It's greater indebtedness, shorter working hours, lower wages, greater food poverty. And they show that in very great detail, traumatic, sad, incredible impacts on the human experience there. So in other words, we are talking of the greatest economic catastrophe to affect the world's poor in our lifetimes. Perhaps since the famines of the late 19th century in India, which Mike Davis wrote about very recently in this book, Late Victorian Holocaust. And here again, we move into the curious ways in which the symbolic world has taken on the appearance of being far more real than the world itself in the past 6 years. For while you'll find all kinds of crises online, you won't find much of this. That, you might say, is often the case, of course, when we're talking about the world's poorest people who usually fail to make the headlines. But we could make a list of social trends which are immense worldwide and literally not discussed in the public sphere, or barely so, as they're covered here and there, perhaps. Structural adjustment 2.0, new internationals, taking place in Africa. Massive increase in gang violence and insecurity across Latin America, which all my Latin American friends talk to me about. Countries like in Brazil, in Ecuador, in Chile, again, very rarely discussed. This is an interesting one. Collapse of many small businesses in China. Massive economic hit, again, hardly discussed. Let alone the one common factor linked to all of these, but again, rarely discussed, which is the systematised metastasizing of global misogyny. From huge increases in child marriage in countries like India, Nigeria, Turkey and Kenya. As you see, before the pandemic, 243 million women and girls were victims of sexual and physical violence. Since the pandemic, this number has risen to 736 million women and girls. This is the UN report on shadow pandemic. Reversal of 3 decades of gains in sexual and reproductive health according to UN Women, big increase in femicide in Latin America, the rise of incel masculinity is promoted across the West by Andrew Tate and others, the rise of the trad wife phenomenon, increases in abortion of female fetuses in India and China, and the execution of feminist protesters in Iran and the forced exclusion of women and girls in Afghanistan not allowed to attend schools. Typically, where people do acknowledge this disgusting global phenomenon, it tends to be in one or another case which suits the identitarian list which somebody has to know, rather than to acknowledge all this collective shameful misogyny as an inevitable consequence of the economic choices made in 2020, where it is known that economic autonomy empowers women and impoverishment harms control over their lives. But why then is there so little collective focus on any of this in the public space? I had an interesting insight on this in a class a couple of months ago, when the issue of worldwide misogyny came up. A student could only address this through the current control of the menstrual cycles rolled out through surveillance apps in the US. And that, to be sure, was a shocking development. When I tried to place it within this broader context, and I said it couldn't be understood in separation from this, I was met with short shrift. The student could only reflect on this horrific phenomenon through the lens of the narrow overview window through which they viewed the world on their social media feed, in which none of these other topics were raised. In other words, the student's response was conditioned by the years of lockdown. As we devolved our lives to screens, expanded the frameworks and intensities of our structural ideations and representations of the world, we found these rabbit holes getting deeper and narrower. The siloisation of the public space intensified hand over fist, which is why people will often gather together around one explanatory paradigm for the world's ills. It's all the fault of COVID, Israel, Islamism, Putin, the far right, the woke left. The devil is indeed in the detail of the algorithm, which by connecting people through the narrowness of their interests, in fact disconnects them from the broader whole to which their interest and its lens on our crisis belongs. Our subjectivity is intensified through the explosion of symbolic representations of the world that we consumed online during COVID. Inevitably, through this intensification, they narrowed and became part of increasingly narrowly defined interest groups. The fragmentation that everyone in the West laments is therefore a direct result of this. The political fragmentation, with all its ugliness and anger, the craven pleasure with its firmest adherents taken spewing out rhetorical violence, means that there is little space for taking a broader view and considering anything that doesn't cohere with one or another silo. So it becomes second nature to point the finger for misogyny at Islamism, at Jewish paedophiles, at MAGA conservative Christians and Donald Trump, online pornography and the incel movement, the Chinese state's control over childbirth policies or trans activists. One or another, instead of recognising that these phenomena are all part of a broader whole. Or to recognise that every time we point our siloed finger, we are adding to the economic value accrued by those who own the internet monopolies, increasing inequalities and intensifying these divides. Here I'm reminded of the brilliant analysis of slavery by the late Haitian political scientist Michel Roltriot in his classic book, Silencing the Past, Power and the Production of History. Triot wrote about the way in which plantation owners sought to explain away the phenomenon of mass flight of the enslaved from their plantations. Slave A ran away because he was particularly mistreated by his master. Slave B was missing because he was not properly fed. Slave X killed herself in a fatal temper. Slave Y poisoned her mistress because she was jealous. The runaway emerges from this literature, which still has its disciples, this is a book written in the 90s, as an animal driven by biological constraints, at best as a pathological case. The rebellious slave, in turn, is a maladjusted Negro, a mutinous adolescent who eats dirt until he dies, an infanticidal mother, a deviant, to the extent that sins of humanity are acknowledged only as evidence of a pathology. In retrospect, this argument is not very convincing to anyone aware of the infinite spectrum of human reactions to forced domination. It is at best an anemic caricature of methodological individualism. Would each single explanation be true, the sum of all of them would say little of the causes and effects of the repetition of such cases. In fact, this argument didn't convince the planters themselves. They held on to it because it was the only scheme that allowed them not to deal with the issue as a mass phenomenon. In sum, until we recognise that the global crisis of misogyny and the global crisis of political polarisation are linked to a much bigger collective phenomenon, we will still be chasing shadows. And for me, that has to start with grasping the interlinked framework of the transformation of our subjectivities produced by the new normativity, in which core aspects of humanity, such as symbolic representation, are being hived off to computation. And second, the related economic transformation of the hyper-concentration of capital, mass inequality, and the collapse of another defining aspect of humanity, productive work, which is also being hived off to computation. To see computation as a form of parasite, now at risk of killing off its human host, may be as useful a metaphor as any for understanding where we are. So we move now towards the final frame I want to discuss. The transformation we've undergone, more befores and afters. Pre-COVID, even among my most distant acquaintance, friends, I knew of only one person under the age of 45 who had ever had a stroke. I now know 4. In the abstract, I suggested that one of the symptoms of the crisis we've been facing is our lack of confidence in our future as humans. Perhaps now it seems clearer what I mean by that. That we no longer have complete faith that the characteristics that have defined humanity for the last 100,000 years, the ability and imperative to do productive work, however at times exploitative and coerced that work may be, the need to create our own symbolic representations of the world, that those characteristics will no longer cut the mustard in the technical carapace that we've created. What are the symptoms of that lack of confidence? First is surely the declining fertility rates. There's been a lot of research money spilled on getting to the bottom of this, whether it's caused by estrogen in the water supply, nanoplastics, the dreaded COVID vaccines. And yet what history tells us, beyond a shadow of a doubt, is that declining fertility and even population collapse always coincides with a crisis of confidence in a society for its future. This was the case in the Native Americans, in the population collapse of the 16th century, it was the case in colonial Africa in the first decades of the 20th century, and it was the case in post-Soviet Russia. It's perhaps easier, even more reassuring, curiously, to seek a scientific cause for this worrying phenomenon than to understand that the cause may be even more alarming than we'd suspected, one without approximate scientific solution, which speaks to how most humans face the future in 2020s. When we consider it more carefully, we can also see how declining fertility rates are the other side of the coin of a second symptom of this lack of confidence in the future, the worldwide misogyny that I discussed just now. How many women are going to choose to have children with males in the climate of uber-toxic masculinity created by the androtext of this world? Speaking now anecdotally, my daughter's generation has, as my oldest, who's 22, puts it, more lesbian than straight women. Is this surprising in the global situation we now confront? A third symptom is certainly the mental health catastrophes that we witness all around us in our work and lives. We all know this to be true, but sometimes need stories to illustrate what that might mean in practice, so here's one. About 10 years ago, I had a student who was my personal tutee at King's, who had some trauma which she couldn't explain and couldn't come onto campus. There was only one building she could come to where she would be able to take classes, otherwise she was unable to come onto the campus. We had a meeting with her in that building and with administrative staff and myself, and basically everybody thought that this person, it's very sad what she's going through, but she can't continue like this. She has to interrupt her studies and come back when she's able to engage. Now, this person who seemed so anomalous and who really wanted to help at the time, that person has been normalised. In the UK, all kinds of mitigating circumstances are accepted, meaning students don't have to attend class. What that means is that they are included in theory, but that in practice they're excluded from the public space, excluded from the classroom, and their absence is normalised. Not surprising in a context where we have normalised our own absence from our workplaces, replacing it with severe outcome. Society has found a way to make it appear as if it is managing and being kind towards someone facing mental ill health, even as it refuses to find ways to meaningfully include them in daily life, and keeps them instead at the far end of a remote team school. All of us know from our own experience that many people have been struggling in one way or another with outcomes like this. We hear it all the time. But as the quotation from Trio suggested, putting all these human struggles together may be only one way of identifying the broader crisis of which they're part. Sorry, maybe the only way of identifying the broader crisis with which they're part. So at the start of this lecture, I said that the lecture would be an act of memory and conclude as a form of remembrance. So I'm going to move towards that now. By remembering here all those who I know personally, whose lives have expressed the difficulties of the struggle that we have been going through. This is a form of public sharing, but also perhaps symbolic of the private griefs that we've all experienced in different ways, and something we know to be true, but again, very rarely feel able to share. So thank you to Muriel for creating a space in which I can do this. Pre-COVID, only at distant removes 2 people who'd taken their own lives. But now that scenario is different. I remember Zoe and her daughter, who was a friend of my older daughter when they were toddlers. Zoe had a hard life as a single parent suffering from depression. Her daughter went to university in September 2021, and she took her life shortly afterwards. I remember Jeff, who was a gay rights activist in the town where I lived for a while in my 30s, very involved in local politics. He married his husband, and they were one of the first gay couples in their town to marry when it was made legal in the UK. Jeff took his life in 2022. Think of my friend Lee, whose son was 20 at the time of the lockdowns. In Lee's peer group, he knows 3 people among his peer group who've taken their own lives. I think of a distant connection in his mid-40s who had 2 strokes and died, whose wife took her life 6 months later, leaving their child an orphan. Think of a distant cousin, cheerful person through much of this life, who also attempted to take her own life. I think of 2 boys who were in my older daughter's class at primary school. Each of them separately had catastrophic skiing accidents which put them on life support. One recovered, but the other still has not, desperate to take risks after having been told for so long to stay safe to protect others. Pre-COVID, I've been teaching at universities for 15 years, and I had never met a student who died, or one who had to take time off because of the death of a sibling. Since COVID, I've taught 2 students whose siblings died from rapid onset cancers. Another whose best friend died suddenly, so they had to quit. Another student suffering from cancer who can't come to class. I remember them all, and Alongside the passing stories of tragedy I've heard far more often than ever in the past. Of a woman whose house backs onto the allotment garden which I have in Cambridge, whose sister and a slew of friends all died rapidly of a variety of causes within 3 months in spring 2023. Of several academics who died at young ages known to friends of mine, of acquaintances who lost most of their close family members within the space of a couple of years. And by bringing them all together, as TRIO encouraged us to do, I know the depth of the crisis that we collectively are going through. And in the midst of such a crisis, it's very easy to blame others. In fact, historically, that's what human beings are tended to do. And in saying this, I'm well aware that people who are struggling or have struggled in the past are probably in truth the braver and truer ones. Those who find it impossible to take the sort of distance that is also implicit in what I've said. The sort of distance that someone who has spent their adult life studying atrocities such as the conquest of Mexico, the Inquisition, and the transatlantic slave trade may find it easy to take. Whatever this is symptomatic of, it is symptomatic of a crisis, a human crisis, and a rupture which COVID has presented from the past. When there are such ruptures, mortality increases, as the historical examples of the Native Americans, colonial Africa, and the post-Soviet Union tell us. And that is now the case here. And we have to acknowledge it for what it is, a social and human crisis, which masqueraded as a medical one. How can we address this? The first step in addressing a problem is surely to articulate it. So my hope is that the rest of this conference can continue to develop some of these themes and suggest a clearer understanding of what this rupture has been like. But to conclude my contribution, it may be helpful to return to medicine itself, which curiously some might say in a conference on COVID has been somewhat lacking from what I've said so far. Medicine teaches us that when the human body is attacked by a hostile virus or bacteria, it expresses symptoms with ever more virulence until it reaches a certain point. Western somatic forms of medical treatment have proceeded according to philosophy of seeking to suppress those symptoms as far as possible in order to protect the human host. However, in this lecture I've suggested we've moved beyond the point where suppressing all of the collective human symptoms of crisis can continue, where that one may work. We've moved into the full-blown expression of symptoms, which is symptomatic of a medical crisis. At that point, the human organism will either express their symptoms with sufficient strength of mind and organism to of mind and will to recover from them, or they will be unable to cope with the symptoms of their crisis and they will die. At this point, as we reach this state of human crisis, it is our collective responsibility, both in this room and beyond it, to ensure that the human social organism survives. And we can only do this by diagnosing the disease from which we're suffering, understanding the symptoms as they're expressed, and ensuring that we preserve real life at all costs, as opposed to Giorgio Agamben, and as Giorgio Agamben put it, as opposed to the bare life of the COVIDians, the so-called preservation of which in 2020 began the process of mass inversion and trauma which we've all been living through ever since.
That was the end. I'll ask questions directly to Toby, but I just wanted to say that in this gloomy picture that you drew, at least we can be here thanks to Trump. I don't know if you know this, but I was supposed to go twice a year to the US, and that's what I had budgeted in my grant. And since Trump became president, nobody wanted to go anymore, so my panels were cancelled, and then myself, I don't want to go anymore either. So the money I saved thanks to Trump is the money we spent on this conference. So at least, yeah, this is
yeah. And as you said, we got to know each other, which otherwise wouldn't have happened.
Yeah. Exactly. So please, if you have questions for Toby.
I think we're digesting.
Yeah.
Yes, everybody's trying to recover.
Why don't we have 2 minutes break? Oh, okay. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. It was super gloomy in its own way, and I'm not as gloomy as you. On this question, I wonder. I'm going to raise a challenge today. So it's all right. You did talk about that world prior to the beginning of 2020. And I, unfortunately, had just finished writing the second draft of a book I'm contracted to write for Verso, which hasn't come out because then COVID happened, which rendered much of the book needing to be rewritten. Hopefully it will come out at some point. However, I had a very definite view about the world in the lead up to that. And to be honest, the trends that we were seeing that were so intensified by COVID, it seems like what was taken advantage of in those 2 years particularly was an acceleration of a bunch of trends. You did refer to them.
Yeah.
I wonder whether or not in some ways we risk, and your talk risks, feeling too positive about 2019 and therefore feeling too gloomy about now?
That's a really good point. I mean, I think I would agree with you in a way, in that I think many of us, if we look back, might think we had a latent sense that this kind of framework was not sustainable in some way, and that something was going to give. Because we knew that the financial crisis had kicked the ball down, just kicked it down the road, and nothing had changed fundamentally in the reasons why that had happened, talking in an economic sense. And as you say, and of course that's what people like in the UK, Matt Hancock said, that these were trends which were going to happen anyway, the fourth industrial revolution was going to happen anyway, and this was the way in which it was brought in. And I think that and clearly human beings are in a relationship with technology, which means that we adapt, and our continuation as a species is in some way linked to the ways in which we can adapt to the transformation of the technology, which we also somehow need to develop to frame that. I think that is all true. And I did say, to be fair, it's interesting that, gloomy, but I did say I wasn't making a value judgment. I think that, there is a sort of the structural sense of what I've said doesn't necessarily mean that we have to look at it. We might simply, as I said, what I'm trying to do is understand what's happened. And so I suppose it depends if you're a glass half, maybe I gave a glass half empty framing of it, but I think we can't pretend that a lot of what I've said is not true, and certainly the framework of reading and writing and structural representations of the world, and work, things which are fundamental to the human experience. We can't pretend that isn't a crisis. We can try and be optimistic about it, and that's what you see, isn't it, on the social media frameworks. Some people will say, oh well, humans have always created work around the different frameworks, and they'll just do that here, and there'll be a bit of a crisis. But that seems to me to be very Panglossian from the trends that we see of unemployment increasing already. Graduate hires declining, and then the trends we see around the world. So, and the funny thing is, Tad, I've always been an optimist, which may sound quite surprising. And I think that, as I said, and I suppose for me, the end of the talk was in a sense optimistic, because I do think that we can address it, but we can't address it unless we articulate it. That would be lovely. 100%. Yeah.
Hi. I want to take up your point in that I have seen those 2 years, as you termed it. It seems like it was much longer than that, but yes. You can say, I completely agree with you, there were trends leading up to it, and in a sense you could say that there was something that culminated in what we saw, in the sense that it became so obvious. And this kind of leads me to the question that I actually wanted to ask. What are we going to do? And I don't think we can answer this now. Maybe we can answer it the day after. Yes, exactly. What are we going to do about the fact that we are the only people who are still talking about it, and everyone else is saying that was 6 years ago? What do you mean? So I think, to me, in a sense, maybe we are the people who saw that those trends had led to this, and I think what you said is exactly right. It wasn't a medical crisis at all. It was a much broader crisis.
Yes.
And I think, as you just said, in order to address something, you need to articulate it, and I think maybe that's what we're here for.
That's what we're here for.
Yeah.
That's what Muriel was.
We need to find words.
And I don't think, in a way, I haven't got an answer. What are we going to do about it? I don't know. I hope we can spend the next 2 days talking about it. Yeah. I hope we can spend the next 2 days talking about it. So I can't answer the question.
I've always wondered if after the 1929 crisis, which I think is like the last thing of such dimension as what we saw during COVID, if people spend their time in the 30s denying that anything really big happened in 1929, I really wonder about this. It's one of the historical things I want to study.
That is a good question, and probably quite a lot of people do.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah. Yes, Tanya.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. It's just so many layers. I'm really just digesting, taking it in. From the legal perspective, as I'm a lawyer, we talked talked a lot about consent, but
Yes.
we talked about it in a very narrow way, consenting to the vaccine mostly. So consent was construed in a very particular way by the lawyers. And your presentation made me think that perhaps this idea of consent needs to be interpreted broader. Did we consent to being reconditioned in these fundamental ways that you mentioned? So basically, I would just love if you could talk a bit more as to how you see consent, especially from a historical perspective. Because precisely, it's exactly what you said, that the time perception got changed and it affected every single person. And I'm teaching also kids and I see how it affected them. But we didn't really consent to that. But the whole human rights movement that started in the 1940s actively was codifying in the conventions dignity, autonomy, and as an individual we need to really be asked in a way. So we didn't consent neither individually nor collectively. So what would be your thoughts on that?
I think that's a really important question. I mean, well, of course, abusers often say silence is consent. And I had a letter from one of the few people in America in my field who will talk to me about this. He said that it reminded him of when there was a case of abuse in the family and then everybody tries to cover it up and pretend that nothing has happened.
Yes.
And the kind of
Yes.
silence which is going on
Yes.
is just like that. And it makes me so that's what your question makes me think of, because consent is twisted around by abusers into something where, you know, oh, everybody's happy because nobody's complaining. So I guess maybe one of the things that we have got to do is find ways to articulate a lack of consent and make sure that that this will be the tip of an iceberg which becomes deeper and deeper and which is able to articulate that. I think articulating a lack of consent into this, as you very rightly said, reconditioning, which we have been forced to accept, is something that we have to find ways to address. Thank you. Yeah.
I mean,
Thank you. If I can go back to the point you made about the far right and far left, increasingly more together since 2020.
Yeah.
I really like the point. I'm very much inclined to agree, but also coming from the background of studying research of this region of Central European region politics and nationalism and media discourse, I can also imagine that many people would say that pandemic was a mere facilitator of this development, that there were convergence already before.
Yeah.
Would you
Yeah,
agree, or would you say that it was more of a game changer in itself?
I mean, you may well be. I mean, I suppose, you know, a good example of this would be the Ukraine war.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because there were a lot of people saying on the far left, or on the left, let's say pre-COVID, you know, talking about the American manipulation of 2014 and all this kind of thing. So it wasn't like that was a surprise, and yet on the other hand, it was also, you know, it was also clear that people on the nationalist right in Europe, such as Marine Le Pen, were you know, sympathetic to Russia. And so therefore there was that convergence there, you are right. I suppose it's, maybe you might have a different view, I'll be interested, but it's hard for me to think of many other themes other than that in which that was clear, but now we can see it as in a number of other themes, so it does seem to have really intensified in a way. But maybe there were other themes, I don't know, again, maybe that's something we can think about. You want to come back?
Mike, I see you're burning to ask something that you don't dare.
Okay, thanks, Toby. I thought that was really good. I mean, I thought it was really good that you pointed out sort of the, you know, increasing sort of deaths and stuff after the sort of massive, almost traumatic event, which you do tend to see with sort of these historical events. But just going to come back to the point that Nadine and Tad was sort of about, you know, what was life like in pre-pandemic. And, you know, the one thing that I remember so much about that really sort of wound me up was this whole new normal. This is the new normal, and we're going to make life. And there's a real sort of drive at the initial few stages, like, okay, things are going to be better. You know, there's sort of coalescing around that. And life was terrible. So there was that sort of view, and then obviously there was this hyper-medicalised dystopia.
Nobody's
horrific, and then everyone was like, oh god, this is awful. So I think there was that. I think the reason why people sort of so caught on to this is the new thing. We'll get on behind, you know, save lives and vaccinate as many people as possible because it was seen as a positive thing to do.
Yeah.
Obviously, in retrospect, it's like, oh god, I think that's why people don't want to talk about it actually, because they completely lost their minds.
Yes.
And who wants to be reminded that you acted like an idiot for so many years? So I think there is that positive, actually, that things weren't so good, and but I think that things have got worse in many ways. But I think in some ways, I think things have changed, and I think it's there is a opportunity for people who are actually going to say this was bullshit.
I agree with that, and I think that actually, thinking back to what a few of you said, thinking back to the pre-COVID era, one of the things we saw, of course, was actually a massive digital utopianism in the first months of COVID. This isn't just going to save lives. It's great. This is the future. It's going to make everything better for everybody.
Make sourdough on it.
Yeah, and there was this massive digital utopianism. Everybody wanted it, and then I remember the first time we went back to teach, that we were going to have hybrid classes, and everybody thought it was great. And then you actually realised that so the way that we put those hybrid classes together in the seminar was to use 4 screens. And after about 2 months, we thought, this is terrible. Nobody wanted this. And very quick. So I suppose one of the reasons maybe that there is this sense of is that was something a lot of people had come to believe in the years pre-2020, was that this was actually going to be something which was going to be positive and transformative for human beings. And in fact, what happened was that everybody saw that that was not the case and felt really disillusioned by that. And I suppose maybe that's one of the reasons why a talk like this ends up being quite glass half empty, because I suppose maybe it reflects that. It reflects that disappointment in that many people felt. This was probably the collective belief that was most widely shared across many societies in the West, and then it turned out to be such a dystopian thought. But yes, but as you say, Mike, that also does create an opportunity to rethink some of that. If we can collectively try and work out how to do that.
If we judge by the numerous audience that came to our conference,
we will have to talk all the more. May I ask the second question?
Yes, you may.
Yes, thank you. May I bring it back to the consent thing, please? Because the thing I was thinking of when you were talking was, you can't consent. People didn't consent to what was happening because you can't, because we didn't know what the hell was happening. I'm going to make one example. One of my students was saying,